Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Real money. In our estimation, that money is more than sufficient for the maintenance and preservation of our road and bridges. The problem comes if you want to add capacity, if you want to build additional new one. On page 9, the City Club has also supported the development of a comprehensive and balanced transportation system for the state that would include funding for mass transit and other forms of transportation in addition to road construction and maintenance.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to keep to
I did not even hear the bell. You didn't hear the bell? No, I didn't. I think I've heard it now.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Jim Gorter, City Club member and member of the Measure 82 Study Committee. While we all agree on the committee that the weight mile tax may be the most fair way to collect and apportion highway taxes, we feel in the minority that the urgent need to provide funding for the maintenance of facilities, current facilities, and for the expansion and safety concerns that are needed to provide for present and current growth in the area outweigh the change in taxing mechanism. Therefore, I would urge that the club adopt the minority report.
Thank you. B.J. Seymour, City Club member. I'd like to underscore the points that Ray was in the process of making, and also to point to one word in the presentation of the last speaker favoring the minority report, which is expansion. I think when I was debating with myself about where I stood on the gas tax, it was when I read the Oregonian's piece about expansion being the key rather than safety or maintenance that I made my decision. Also, I don't think it's a good idea to accept a measure that is flawed because you don't think you can get a better one. I think we should hang in there and wait for a better measure. I favor the majority report.
Thank you very much. Do we have another speaker for the minority?
John Leeper, City Club member. I would like to speak in support of the minority report. I feel the opposition to this, primarily from AAA, has told that part of the story that is beneficial to them, and I think in the interest of fairness, we should recognize, as has been stated earlier, the state has got a crying need for money for roads, both maintenance as well as improvement. Another thing, this measure has got a sunset feature to it. It isn't as if it is just going to go on and on forever. And in light of all those points, once again, I speak in favor of the minority report.
Thank you.
My name is Mike Katz, member of the City Club. I speak in favor of the majority report. I disagree with Ray Polani and B.J. Seymour, who preceded me. I am persuaded by my friend Henry Hewitt, who spoke at the other microphone, that funds are needed and that it is a matter of some importance. But I am even more persuaded of the appropriateness of the weight mile tax. According to studies that are done by people at Willamette University, cited in the report here, Tom Hibbert and Don Nigri, as well as the cost responsibility studies done every 2 years or so by the Department of Transportation, If a truck weight is increased by 100%, if the weight of a truck is doubled, its contribution to damage and costs of the highway is increased by 300%. A 100% increase in weight yields a 300% increase in damage to the highway and cost to the highways, but only a 30% increase in the consumption of fuel. The defense rests.
Thank you, Mike.
Jeannie Burt, member and member of the study committee. It seems that the weight mile tax that we've had for so long has served us very well. Oregon has, perhaps arguably, the most fair mechanism to pay for roads. It seems only likely that the weight mile, if it's fair, should be continued in order to continue the tradition that we have of fair taxing. Weight mile is the only way to do it, I feel.
Thank you. Charlie?
Madam Chair, I move the previous question.
The question has been called for. We will now proceed with the vote to substitute the minority report for the majority report, which requires a simple majority for approval. Now, just to restate, the minority report is supportive of a yes vote on ballot measure 82. Please raise your voting cards high. All those opposed? Okay. All those opposed to substituting the minority? It's been a long time since high school. All in favor of the substitute measure, please raise your cards high. Okay. Do you think we need a... Okay. All those opposed? Okay. The City Club membership has voted to oppose the substitution of the minority report for the majority report. We will now vote to adopt the Measure 82 report with the majority recommendation. Is there any more discussion?
I think this is the right microphone now. I will read what I finished to read before. On page 11, the resulting project will lead to urban sprawl, more congestion, and will encumber the state with even more funding obligation to maintain a bloated, inefficient network of roads. Measure 82 makes little or no contribution in addressing the land use planning and mass transit needs in the state. And still on page 11, congestion is cited by some as an indicator that land use and mass transit planning deserve at least as much attention as road maintenance and construction. From 1987 to 1997, 10 years, Oregon population increased by 16% and vehicle travel on Oregon roads increased by 38%. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Jim Harris. I'm a City Club member and also a member of the committee. One of the reasons that I'm supporting the committee recommendation, the majority recommendation, is the fact that we're really supporting taking a half step back so we can take some more steps forward. What's not very clear in a lot of the things you've seen on radio and TV is that, in fact, if Measure 82 fails, the weight mile tax rates are going to go down a little over 12%. Because you all passed Measure 76 last fall that said heavy vehicles and light vehicles have to pay their fair share. Trucks have been overpaying. Whether you like that or not, they've been overpaying. So what's going to happen is either the gas tax goes up or the weight mile tax comes down. That's the half step backwards. The step forward is that by keeping the weight mile tax, instead of going to a high registration fee, you don't have large inequities between different classes of truckers in the state. Oregon charges their truckers twice per mile as the average of the other states. And as soon as you start having unfairnesses between classes of truckers, there'll be tremendous pressure to bring that total burden down, and you lose cost responsibility. So for that reason, I'm suggesting that we go against it and have the legislature raise the taxes next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Call the question. We will now vote to adopt the Measure 82 report with the majority recommendation, which represents a no on ballot 82. Please raise your cards, all in favor of adopting the majority recommendation. All opposed? It is clear that there is a resounding majority vote in support of the majority recommendation. The City Club of Portland has formally voted to adopt the Measure 82 report with the majority recommendation. The club's position then is a no vote on ballot measure 82. Our thanks to Jay, Marcus, and the members of the committee for their excellent work on this report, and thanks to all of you who brought forward and shared your comments with us today. Please note that additional copies of City Club reports are available in the City Club office. Now on to today's program. Our member host today is Dan Goldie, former member of the Board of Governors and member of the World Affairs Council, co-sponsor of this afternoon's program. He will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Dan's question, we will open the program to questions from City Club and World Affairs Council members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone even before Dan is finished so that we have time to ask as many questions as possible. And I will ring Dan's bell if he runs over. Guess that's sort of like pulling Dan's chain, but I don't know. Please identify yourself as a member of either City Club or the World Affairs Council and ask your questions in 30 seconds or less. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from the following Friends of City Club: PGE, Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt PC, Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation. We are extremely grateful for their ongoing support. It's now my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's program. Leslie Elliot Armijo is currently visiting associate professor of political science and political economy at Reed College. This is a little nepotistic, I admit, because that's where I spend the better part of my working day as well. Leslie earned her bachelor's degree at Cornell University and her master's and Ph.D. at Berkeley. The recipient of many awards and honors, including Fulbright fellowships to India and Brazil, she has written widely on the interaction of democratization and economic reform, the politics of inflation, privatization, and Latin American and South Asian politics. Her book, Financial Globalization and Democracy in Emerging Markets, was published by Macmillan and St. Martin's Press last year, and a new book, Debating the Global Financial Architecture, is forthcoming from SUNY Press. As we all know, the United States confronts momentous decisions today. In just 2 weeks, the United States House of Representatives is expected to vote on establishing permanent trade relations with China. The vote will play out against a backdrop of the progressive left and the conservative right, both wanting to vitiate or simply abolish the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the forerunner of the World Trade Organization. Is this vision or folly? Please join me in welcoming Professor Armijo, who will examine from an historical and political perspective the contemporary economic question: globalization, can we opt out? Do we need the IMF, World Bank, and WTO? Leslie.
Thank you, Harriet.
Whoa.
Thank you, Harriet. I'm delighted to be here addressing the City Club and the World Affairs Council. Please, if you can't hear me at any time, wave your hand. The last thing I want to do is not be heard. What I'm going to do today is try to address 4 topics. I have 5 single-spaced pages of notes, so I will say what I can, and I may just hint at some of the things I want to say. If you're interested, ask me in the questions. The first topic I want to address is probably the most important in the long run, and that is the way we as Americans interested in public policy think about the international political economy. And I'm going to suggest that there are 2 dimensions on which most of us divide, and that gives us a nice 2x2 table. So I'm going to try to identify 4 squares then that most of us fall in, and tell you, of course, why I think 1 square is the most sensible square. Then I'm going to be more concrete and talk about trade with China. I will support the vote for permanent normal trade relations with China. Then I'm going to go on and talk about the so-called Bretton Woods trio, their origins, what they've done briefly over the last 50 years. You realize why I'm going to have to speak quickly and rather telegraphically. And some of the attacks on them today. By the Bretton Woods trio, of course, I mean the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank. And then I will conclude by repeating my points at the beginning. So 3 main parts then. The first part is, how should we think about the international political economy? It seems to me that contemporary positions on this divide along 2 lines. One dimension is how people conceptualize the nature of the international economy, and the other is how they conceptualize the U.S.'s ideal political role in the world. So the first dimension is, what is the nature of the international economy? On the one hand, there are those who see the global economy as essentially self-regulating, autonomous, growing by itself. The images here are the global economy as being driven by markets. It's being driven by technological change, the invention of computers, advances in telecommunications. The internet can reach to the, at least potentially, the most remote village in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. We're all getting richer. And it pretty much happens without anyone doing anything. That's the essence of this. Global markets are autonomous and on their own trajectory. The opposite view of the international economy is one that says, no, what we have today, what we've had since the Second World War, is a very carefully constructed and maintained international system, international capitalist system that's been very prosperous, but that rests fundamentally and essentially on political decisions initially by the major Allied powers at the end of the Second World War to construct a global economy that worked. And this view says the international economy must be managed. It's essentially fragile, and it rests on institutions and agreements. The other side of my proposed 2x2 table is the U.S. role in the world. And here again, I think there are 2 basic views. View 1 is the responsibility of U.S. leaders is to reflect the concerns and preferences of the U.S. public. Therefore, the default option should be we should act unilaterally. We're powerful enough, and we are, of course, the ones who know our own interests best, and we should make up our own mind issue by issue in the international arena. The second view is multilateralism is good. It's good because it works, because it's more likely in the medium and long run to promote peace and prosperity, and perhaps even it's good because in some sense it's just. We are, of course, the bull in the china shop and continue to be, but it is a good idea to share with the rest of the world's people some discussion about international institutions, organizations, and what happens. So then the table is along the economic dimension, the global economy needs management, the global economy runs by itself. Along the political dimension, the US should act unilaterally, the US should act multilaterally. If you haven't figured it out, I am locating myself in the US economy, or the global economy needs management, and it should be multilateral by preference box. Who else is in that box? This is what you could call, or what has been called, the liberal foreign policy establishment. This is institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, think tanks like the Institute for International Economics or the Brookings Institution, journalists like Thomas Friedman in the New York Times. Moving down to the international economy needs management, but it's better if you can to act unilaterally, would be the traditional conservative foreign policy establishment, who essentially don't trust giving up any increments of US sovereignty to anyone else. And this would be, say, Nixon, Kissinger, today the Hoover Institution, and perhaps Bush, but I don't want to characterize him too clearly, that is, candidate Bush. And journalists like Irving Kristol or William Safire or the Buckleys. Now, perhaps the more interesting thing is the numbers of groups of people who are interested in policy who find themselves in the other column, that is the column of the global economy doesn't need active management. It's just there, and we can assume it's going to be there. Some of these people are actually, in their heart, multilateralists. And here I would put the progressive left, self-styled progressive left. That is the anti-globalization people who think that the United States ought to withdraw from the World Trade Organization, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank are imperfect and ought to be abolished, and yet believe that there ought to be multilateral cooperation around ecological issues, human rights issues. This would be groups like the Friends of the Earth, Ralph Nader's group, Public Citizen, the International Forum on Globalization, that was one of the groups that organized the protest in Seattle against the ministerial meeting of the WTO, and sometimes American labor. American labor, I would argue, kind of shifts between the multilateral box and the unilateral box. And finally, the last box of those who essentially believe in unilateral US action, but who don't see the international economy as needing much help in order to function, would include libertarians, the Cato Institute, those who see the international economy as being essentially markets. It's free markets, period, end of story. You don't need the IMF because it doesn't do anything, it just gets in the way. You don't need regulations. The analogy is domestic economies, free markets work because people buy and sell, period, end of story. No recognition, I would argue, of the role played by institutions like central banks and so on and so on and so forth. Also in this group, of course, are the conservative isolationists, Jesse Helms, and the what you might call the nativist populist, Pat Buchanan. I would like to argue today that this is an important issue, that those in the boxes that say the global economy doesn't need to be managed are growing, that it's important to counter that idea, and I would also, as I said, argue for multilateralism. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk for a minute about sort of a very specific policy issue, the upcoming trade vote about normal trade relations with China. As probably everyone in this room knows, this is not a vote on whether China should enter the WTO. That takes place in the WTO, and the U.S. only has one vote. It's a vote on whether the United States should normalize its trading relations with China. In other words, not have an annual process whereby Congress decides whether we ought to give China trade relations for another year, and then we'll review it again. The argument in favor, the argument against normalizing relations has two components. One component is it sends the wrong diplomatic signal. If you vote to give China normal trade relations, then you're voting against Tibet, you're voting against Christians in China, the Falun Gong, you're voting against intellectuals and students who protested at Tiananmen Square and who are, according to my New York Times, right now being hassled because of the things that are appearing on the internet and in newspapers. The other argument against bringing China in is a kind of realpolitik one. It says, look, the more integrated China gets with the global system, the more successful its economy is going to be, and we don't like that because the Chinese government is oppressive and authoritarian, so we shouldn't let them in. I think there are a number of good, convincing arguments to vote reasons that the United States Congress ought to vote to give China permanent normal trade relations. And I've divided these into political arguments and economic ones. The political arguments are as follows. First of all, there's a practical one. China is a world power. According to exchange rates, which are always off a little bit, according to the World Bank, at current exchange rate, China has the 7th largest economy in the world. Also, according to the World Bank's most recent annual report, if you estimate the size of economies by another measure called purchasing power parity, China has the 2nd largest economy in the world, after us. I think it's nuts to think that we are better off excluding China from the network of international organizations that do, I would argue, support the relative peace, at least major power peace, and quite unparalleled prosperity that we've had for the past 50-odd years. It just doesn't make sense. In other words, the same argument for letting China take Taiwan's seat at the UN in the early 70s holds today for supporting normal trade relations. I also, as a political scientist, believe that there are two other good reasons why it's particularly good with respect to China. I do think that the argument about enmeshing China in international obligations makes sense. We have some common interests with China, such as controlling North Korea, on which an issue that China has cooperated with the U.S. on, such as Russia not imploding politically, etc. It makes no sense to antagonize China without getting anything in return. And finally, there's the argument about human rights. I would also say that given the particular nature of the Chinese regime, enmeshing China in trade relations actually does further human rights. It's not true for all authoritarian regimes. But if you have a regime, a political regime, that is a political system, that is very closed to the point that basic things like freedom of travel, freedom of information, freedom, being able to read books from outside and so on, where it's that closed, and much of China is, then opening trading relations, which does force open at least things like travel and exchange of ideas, is going to push that regime a little bit in a liberalizing direction. Now, I would caution that this isn't true for all authoritarian regimes. For example, most political scientists would say that, Indonesia was a relatively liberal regime under Suharto. You could travel easily, you could read pretty much what you want, but it was still an authoritarian regime and a very corrupt one. In that case, I think the argument for enmeshing Indonesia further in the international trading system doesn't hold. But given where China is, I think it does. In other words, I would even come down and say it's probably a step in the direction of democratization and, or at least political liberalization for China to be more connected with the global economy. And of course, there are a whole series of, one more political reason and then a whole series of economic reasons. The other political reason is historical analogy. At the end of the First World War, the victorious Allies established an international organization, the League of Nations, a new idea, of course, largely coming out of the ideas of our own president then, Woodrow Wilson. And the idea was collective security. Instead of having alliances that would oblige countries to go to war when one of their partners was attacked, rather, let's have a club and all the major powers will be a member, and if one of them is attacked, all the others will censure it or sanction it. Well, there are lots of reasons why the League of Nations didn't work, and of course the United States didn't join. But one of the, in retrospect, really foolish things its designers did was to initially not allow the defeated powers to join, that is Germany and Austria, because they had been bad. The idea was they had to earn the right to be a member of the League of Nations. And it seems to me, and now I'm speaking in my international politics professor hat, that's just not the way to get somebody to play by your rules. And I see a very close analogy to the notion that we could get China to behave better by keeping it out of major international organizations. And finally, there are the economic issues. We're not giving up anything by giving China normal trade status in terms of specific tariffs or things. It is China, however, that when it joins the WTO, which is going to happen anyway, whether we are actively in support of this or not, it is China that is undertaking to move its domestic economic regulatory system more in the direction of one that supports markets, more rule of law, more level playing field, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I'm going to try to do the rest in 5 minutes. We will see. I want to say a little bit about the Bretton Woods institutions. The short reason for why we need them is the interwar period. That is, the period between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second. For a variety of reasons, the global economy that had been constructed largely on the basis of British leadership, dating from, say, the mid-19th century up to the beginning of World War I, for a variety of reasons, that fell apart. The de facto rules of the game before World War I were the gold standard and mostly free trade, and Britain as the backstopping country and the financial power, as well as, of course, the trading and manufacturing power. During the interwar period, the only country that had the possibility of providing that leadership for maintaining a multilateral a set of international institutions was the United States, and the United States wasn't interested. The United States wasn't interested in joining the League of Nations. The United States also wasn't interested in participating actively in various conferences to try to either reinstate the gold standard or come up with something new. There were several conferences in the 20s. The US sent observers, but forbade them to vote. By the time the United States tried to do a little bit to help in the 30s, it was pretty much too late. And there are, obviously I'm giving you a very kind of brief view of what happened in the 30s, but I think the 20s and the 30s, but the numbers speak for themselves. First of all, what happened? Trade crashed, international payments crashed, most countries' currencies became inconvertible. There was no more international credit to speak of. And of course, there was the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, for a 10-year period, US annual growth was negative 0.5%. That is, 0.5% negative growth annually. The previous period of mostly free trade was a period when global growth was about 2.1%. Some countries continued growing somewhat during the interwar period, but nonetheless, the global level of annual economic growth was about 1.9, 1.8%, and of course, as I said, in the US, in the 30s, it was nothing. After the war, and I would argue largely on the basis of the establishment of the World Bank, the IMF, and the Trade Organization, ultimately becoming the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, in 1996, the WTO. Largely on the basis of those, I would argue, growth from 1950 to 1992, and these were the figures I was able to get quickly, was 4.3%. That's a big jump. And we've become used to it now, so used to it, and here we go back to my initial point, people think it's normal. I would argue it's not normal. Let me close then, or try to wrap this up by just saying a little bit about each of these institutions and why we need them. The IMF was established, the International Monetary Fund was established with the brief of easing international payments so that countries, especially major countries, wouldn't go through periods where their currencies became inconvertible. So international trade and payments would crash. The IMF, that is, was created to help out countries with temporary illiquidity in their balance of payments. It was also to manage the fixed exchange rate system that came out of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and lasted until the early 70s. Since the end of the fixed exchange rate system in the 70s and in the 80s and 90s, particularly since the so-called Third World or Latin American debt crisis in 1982, the IMF has turned more toward easing temporary payments crises in developing countries as opposed to the advanced industrial democracies, who were the major recipients of its loans up through the early 70s. It has a crucial role to play. Anyone who's followed the series of international crises, financial crises over the last 10 years, and this happens to be my area of expertise, will know that there are many of us who believe that the global economy indeed would have crashed on several occasions had it not been for multilateral cooperation through such institutions as the IMF, as well as leadership by the biggest country in the world. That's still us. And I'm talking about, for example, the 1982 Latin American debt crisis, which was a severe, but a potentially severe problem for US banks, which would then have quite easily spread around the world. I'm talking about, there was another financial crisis in 92, 93 that I think is important. This is a crisis in Europe's exchange rate mechanism. The IMF did not directly get involved in that, but there was certainly multilateral cooperation, mainly in Europe. The IMF did get directly involved in the 1994-95 peso crisis in Mexico and the so-called tequila effect spreading throughout emerging markets in Latin America. And of course, in the more recent 97 through 99 Asian financial crisis. And I would argue its involvement was crucial. Doesn't mean the IMF is perfect, it's not. I'm with, for example, Joseph Stiglitz, who recently resigned as the chief economist of the World Bank, at least partly because he was very critical of the specifics of IMF programs in East Asia. But that doesn't mean you get rid of the IMF. I think some of the proposals on the table are really quite dangerous. For example, you're probably familiar with proposals from the left because that's what we hear in Portland more. That is the anti-globalization coalition that sees the IMF as the embodiment of evil capitalism trying to crush poor people. But there are equally strong and perhaps more likely to succeed opponents in this box of those who believe the international economy can manage itself, that is, we don't need an IMF, and unilateral action, as represented, for example, by the majority opinion in the report known as the Meltzer Report, presented in March to the House Banking Committee. This was mandated by the committee as part of the quid pro quo for coming up at the height of the Asian financial crisis with the U.S. Contribution to the IMF, which Congress didn't want to give. And part of the deal to get that through, it's crazy that we couldn't do that, was to have this commission. But Alan Meltzer is someone whose opinions are close to those of Milton Friedman, believes that the problem of moral hazard, those of you who are economists or bankers will know that, means that actually the IMF just makes things worse, just like a central bank domestically makes things worse because you encourage over-lending and because banks and lenders just know they'll be bailed out. And so really it would be better to get rid of it. The committee, which had a variety of people on it, although it was stacked by conservative and fairly isolationist Republicans who appointed the committee, came up with a recommendation that in essence the IMF only loan to countries that, quote, pre-qualify, that is, meet a series of conditions. Those conditions are such that in essence only advanced industrial countries would qualify. Virtually none of the major emerging market countries, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, that recently suffered the Asian financial crisis would qualify, much less Russia, Brazil. And they also came up with recommendations to drastically scale back the World Bank. Well, I think I need to stop. I had things to say about the WTO and the World Bank. If anyone wants me to give you my 2-minute take on them, ask me in questions. My 25 words or less take is they're not perfect, but they're a lot better than not having them. Certainly they can be reformed. I would not favor, though, the reform proposals that are so drastic that they would hobble them. I think they've done remarkable things with the aid of leadership from countries like the United States. And I'm not a U.S. apologist. I'm a good liberal Democrat. I grew up in Berkeley, but I think that we need these institutions, and we've been very lucky to live in these last 50 years and not some other ones, and I don't want to see them vitiated. So I think that I need to wind up. Maybe I'll say one more thing, which is why now? Why do we have this reaction against U.S. international involvement, to put it most simply? Of course, it's partly because of the end of the Cold War. It's partly because of stresses of globalization. The United States, for example, is more integrated into the trading system than before, and there are some genuine stresses. There are reasons to believe that business on the whole is gaining more than labor from the types of trade going on today. I'm not going to go into that. I would say that we would all be better off if those who benefit easily from globalization recognize that there were those who didn't benefit easily, because it would be a shame to lose the benefits of an open economy. But the main points then are, I think we need to value the institutions that have enabled the international economy to work. It doesn't work by itself. We need to engage in the international system. It also doesn't manage itself. The United States still, even though it's less overwhelmingly powerful than it was at the end of World War II, accounts for, depending on how you measure it, something between 20 and 30% of the global economy. That's a huge chunk. We are, of course, the only remaining superpower, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important that we not forget that.
Leslie, thank you very much for putting a little light on a subject on which mostly we have seen heat in the last several months, couple of months. I just got back from Washington last night, Leslie, and while I was there, I had an opportunity to talk to members of Congress and others, and they tell me that although there's a pretty overwhelming potential vote in the Senate for PNTR, the normal trade relations with China, that the vote in the House, which will come, I think, next week, is too close to call. And my question is, given the fact that this will be the fourth major confrontation in the Congress on the issue of trade and globalization, the first being when the president lost fast-track authority, the second over money for the IMF, which was won with a big concession to the anti-abortionists, and the third was the African trade bill, which was just passed last week, won by the pro-trade people with some concessions. My question is, if Congress, if the House votes against admission of China into the WTO, against PNTR, what will be, number one, the economic effects, and two, will it create a domino? Is it a symbolic vote against WTO, IMF, and the World Bank?
Thanks, Dan. Well, let me take the last part first. Of course, it's a symbolic vote. And all the anti-globalizers on both the left and the right will be happy and will see it as a victory and will be encouraged, just as the derailing of the ministerial meeting in Seattle in November of the WTO was seen as a great victory. Now, in truth, that was partly because there were disagreements among the major advanced industrial countries, but it was certainly also partly because of the people in the street. And I think that's sad, and I think it's, as I said, sadly, wrongly, terribly mistaken, and based on a misapprehension of how the international economy works. In terms of effects or implications for the U.S. domestic economy, well, we just shut ourselves out of trade with China. Eventually, China will join the WTO. And then there's the issue of U.S. businesses probably being discriminated against if they don't extend easy reciprocal trade relations to China in areas that we would be likely to be able to sell things to China. As I understand, these would include agriculture, automobiles, telecommunications, and various other things. And that list, by the way, comes from a New York Times article a couple days ago on the trade vote, at which I think all the living former presidents managed to show up, from Gerald Ford to Bush to Jimmy Carter, and also Kissinger and various other notables from both the what I've called the liberal foreign policy establishment and the conservative foreign policy establishment, saying that we need this vote and we're just going to shut ourselves out economically if we don't go with it.
Professor, I really liked your four-part box analysis. I wonder if you could give us an explanation of Thomas Friedman's golden straitjacket kind of thing, and then give your take on its effect, as far as the box goes, on, say, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil in Latin America, and maybe Thailand and South Korea in Asia.
Let me make sure I understand the question. The question is, if the U.S. Persists in trying to punish China for human rights violations by not giving it permanent normal trade relations, then how is this going to be perceived in the major emerging market countries?
No, I guess I was going back a ways from Dan's question to the more basic understanding of what's happening overall from the standpoint of, say, the Cato Institute or a libertarian point of view, that the market, in the form of the golden straitjacket, is causing changes that are really counter to where I might be and where I gather you are in terms of the multilateralist approach. It seems to me that there are significant market forces if you believe the golden straitjacket approach and the three democratizations that go with it.
You know, I haven't actually read my copy of The Lexus and the Olive Tree yet, so well, I'm still not completely sure I am responding to what you asked, but let me say something about it. One of the things that's, I guess the word is ironic or something like that, about the intense reaction in the United States and other advanced industrial countries, but particularly the United States, against globalization and against free trade, is that developing countries have made great strides over the last 10, 15 years, and many of them are getting, in terms of liberalization, often at some cost. This is particularly difficult in countries like almost all of those you mentioned, Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, Korea, that have recently become democratic and therefore have populations that want to be protected from job losses and big swings in the exchange rate and things like that. But they're doing it partly because they see the economic benefits from it, and also partly because they're under pressure from the United States and the IMF. Mostly good, but sometimes bad. As I said, I would agree with the analysis that the IMF gave probably the wrong prescriptions to countries like Korea, Thailand, Indonesia in the recent Asian financial crisis. Now, intervention by the IMF and the G7 powers did prevent a spreading global financial catastrophe. It could have been done with less cost in countries like Indonesia. I think, finally, that all the countries you mentioned realize, even India realize that they need to liberalize economically. Some of them would like to do it a little more slowly and things like opening up their capital account. But even countries like India have liberalized dramatically in the last 10 years and have seen some growth consequences. But those are the countries that have much more severe domestic adjustment issues, and they don't understand why, for example, countries like the United States can't liberalize their trade in the areas in which those countries are competitive, such as textiles and apparel and low-tech manufacturers. And they find themselves very frustrated.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I'm very distressed because the acoustics in this room at the Hilton has always been miserable for me. So I don't know if anybody else has the same feeling, but I dread the thought of coming here. Anyhow, I wanted to ask a question, and I want to preface it by saying, in my opinion, governments are the necessary result of social compacts. And it seems to me that we're moving very rapidly to a global economy without moving at all towards a global participatory government. And that, I think, is probably the main problem. And at some point, this will have come to pass. May I ask, do you have any suggestions? Do you have any ideas on how we can move to a global participatory government to match the global economy that we're building?
Well, As I said, I'm a multilateralist. I mean, if you scratch me and you want to know my true colors, I would be happy to see a global participatory government. It's not in the cards at the moment, but it seems to me that those who care about things like democracy should support participation in multilateral institutions. I would like to point out, for example, that the WTO operates on a one country, one vote system. This is not as democratic, perhaps, as a one person, one vote system, but it is more democratic than, say, the UN Security Council or the voting in either the World Bank or the IMF, which is based on how much money you contributed to the institutions. And I'm always astonished by the people who find the WTO terribly undemocratic. I gave a talk at Reed last semester, and someone with whom I was debating said something like, "Who elected Charlene Barshevsky?" And I kind of thought, well, you know, she was appointed by the president, and he was, after all, elected. So I just think that we can't jump to a completely participatory system, but it is important to remember that a lot of big developing countries, India, Brazil, not China yet, Thailand, Korea, Mexico probably, are democracies now, Argentina, and their governments represent their people, and I think we ought to listen to them. The developing countries as a whole were quite distressed by the, at least for the moment, failure of opening a new round of trade liberalization.
Professor Peter Paulson, City Club member, would you care to give us any information, if you have it, in regard to Robert Reich's comments that were quoted by Molly Ivins and Thomas Friedman about labor? How about the American labor? Is there any movement in the American labor movement to develop their own clout by getting Congress and the administration to take away that, to ban the permanent replacement of striking workers, and to fine 3 times the amount of money of those employers who do fire labor union enthusiasts? Is there any movement that you know of that's in the labor movement at this time to get Congress to support the entrance of China?
Okay, for those who couldn't hear him, he was referring to the recent suggestions by Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, who's now at Brandeis University, I believe, that were summarized in Thomas Friedman's New York Times column a couple days ago. And they were some specific suggestions about how labor might be brought on board a broad free trade coalition by getting some kind of other side payment from business, such as stronger penalties for permanent replacement of striking labor and things like that. First of all, I have to say I'm not an expert in American politics. My area is international politics and developing countries and the international political economy. I don't follow American labor terribly closely. One thing that I think needs to be said, though, and I referred to it very briefly in my talk, was the fact that some of the kinds of trade that have developed in the last 10, 20 years are not traditional trade where countries trade things that are made in their country and then they trade it, but they're really globalization of production. They're really multinational investment going abroad. And for reasons that I can't go into now, I think that this produces a domestic politics that's less between sectors, where in a certain sector you have business owners and labor opposed to trade openings, say textiles, and in another sector you have business owners and labor in favor of it, say semiconductors. And today, for reasons that are hard to go into quickly, but have something to do with multinational production, there is much more there are a lot of things that are good for business and fewer things that are good for labor. I think this is why you're getting more broad coalition of labor against trade in general. And the bottom line